Night over Berlin, a city of blacked-out windows and echoing footsteps. Somewhere, deep below ground, a concrete bunker hums with generators. Couriers pass each other on stairwells without making eye contact. A dictator's schedule moves like a cipher, unpredictable by design. We begin with a question that sat sealed in Soviet files for decades. Did Moscow plan to kill Adolf Hitler in 1943? After 1991, fragments surfaced, memos, recollections, red-stamped directives that suggest the answer is more complicated than rumor or myth. There were plans. There were debates. There were rehearsals in other cities. And there were reasons, cold, strategic reasons, to not pull the trigger. This is the story of an operation that hovered between the possible and the disastrous. A story of people asked to weigh a single life against the trajectory of a global war. By the winter of 1942-43, the Eastern Front had changed. Stalingrad shattered the aura of invincibility, and the Red Army began to grind forward. Inside the Soviet security apparatus, the map of Europe looked like a chessboard stretching from the forests of Belarus to the ministries of Berlin. At the center of this apparatus stood the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, the NKVD, under Lavrenti Beria, with overlapping responsibilities across internal security, border troops, and special operations. Alongside it, sometimes merged, sometimes separate, was the state security organ handling foreign intelligence, the NKGB. Throughout the war, these bodies were reorganized. For clarity, we'll refer to Soviet state security when the exact label changed with the month. Within this labyrinth, one directorate mattered most for what we're exploring: the division tasked with sabotage, partisan support, and special tasks behind enemy lines. Its officers trained demolition experts, radio operators, forgers, and couriers who could cross borders with new names and new lives. Their doctrine was blunt: isolate the enemy's command, sever his logistics, and when needed, remove key figures, quietly. The question of Hitler's removal had hovered since 1941, but it sharpened in 1943. The year began with the Red Army advancing from the Volga, the Wehrmacht reeling, and all sides guessing what the next shock would be. In that context, Soviet planners weighed the assassination of the enemy's supreme leader not as vengeance, but as a tool. How would such an operation look? It would start with intelligence, not explosives. Soviet case officers in neutral capitals, Stockholm, Bern, Istanbul, scanned the human landscape for a single point of entry: a chauffeur with debts, a clerk with a grudge, a cousin who handled deliveries to a ministry residence. In Berlin itself, Soviet networks had suffered. Pre-war sources inside the German apparatus were rolled up or silenced. The most famous anti-Nazi spy networks, the Red Orchestra, fed largely by military intelligence rather than the NKVD, had been crippled by 1943. Any new attempt had to seed new assets or reach Hitler's environment through a chain of intermediaries. The method? The files, where they survive, sketch alternatives rather than a single blueprint. A bomb along a motorcade route in Berlin. A briefcase placed inside a meeting room. A poison delivered through food prepared by vetted staff. a rifle shot from an apartment window at a public ceremony. Each scenario demanded proximity. Each collided with the reality of Hitler's security. The Führerbegleitkommando of hand-picked guards. The Reichssicherheitsdienst shadowing every approach. The practice of sudden schedule changes and decoy movements. After 1942, Hitler's public appearances tightened, and by 1943, the construction of the new Führer bunker had begun to shelter him beneath layers of concrete and secrecy. The barrier was not only operational, it was political. Inside Moscow, the strategic discussion, rarely captured verbatim, surfaces in memoirs and secondary notes. Some accounts, published after the collapse of the Soviet Union, claim that the leadership was briefed on plans to attempt Hitler's assassination in 1943, but decided against it. The reasoning, as reported in those recollections, was stark. Hitler's military interference had produced catastrophic decisions for Germany. The insistence on holding ground at Stalingrad, the delay and rigidity before Kursk. Removing him might empower professional soldiers who would fight more rationally. The war, in this view, could grow longer, bloodier. It is important to label this as contested. The most detailed narratives trace back to insiders writing decades later, after archival material had begun to trickle out. They present a consistent logic, but not always the underlying documents. Historians disagree on whether an explicit "do not kill Hitler" directive was issued in 1943, or whether planners simply encountered a wall of practicality and risk. What the post-1991 glimpses show, however, is a system capable of such a mission, debating it in the language of cost and outcome rather than taboo. To understand that capability, we leave Berlin and walk through a case study far from the Reich's chancery. Minsk, 1943. By the summer of that year, Soviet partisans, guided and supplied by state security and the central staff of the partisan movement, had penetrated the German occupation network in Belarus. They had couriers in city apartments, caches in cellars, and access through kitchen doors and cleaning schedules to the routines of occupation officials. On September 22, 1943, a bomb placed in the residence of Wilhelm Kube, the Gauleiter of General Bezirk Weißruthenian, detonated and killed him. The weapon was smuggled in by a maid recruited by Soviet agents and partisans. The plan required weeks of preparation, forged identities, and the subversion of the house's internal hierarchies. The Kube operation demonstrates three things relevant to our story. First, infiltration of high-security residences was possible. Second, the choice of method, a concealed explosive, matched the constraints of domestic space and surveillance. Third, the price of success was brutal. Retaliation swept Minsk. Collaborators were hunted, civilians suffered. In the calculus of special operations, the tactical blow rippled through an occupied society. Planners in Moscow could do this in Minsk. Could they do it in Berlin? The vector into Berlin was narrower. Security was denser. The circle around Hitler tighter. The language of trust coded in personal loyalty. A maid in a Gauleiter's residence could be recruited by clever women from the city. A maid in Hitler's kitchen was screened, monitored, and root and branch bound to the Reich's inner sanctum. An apartment overlooking a motorcade route might be available. A shot would be possible. But schedules moved like smoke. Motorcades rerouted. And if the shot missed, if the bomb failed, there would be no second chance. The center would harden further. The British and Americans wrestled with a similar problem. In 1943-44, London's Special Operations Executive and Washington's Office of Strategic Services assessed the idea of killing Hitler, then stepped back. Their reasons were close to those reported in Soviet circles. No guarantee of success, the risk of strengthening German military leadership, the possibility of turning Hitler into a martyr whose death could rally a nation's fear. In other words, the logic of assassination ran alongside the logic of war. The Soviets were not alone in thinking this way. Yet, inside the Soviet security services, 1943 was also a year of technical refinement. Radio nets became more robust, exfiltration routes more professional, and explosives more reliable. In training schools near Moscow, recruits practiced with timers and acid fuses, learned to set pressure mines beneath vehicles, and memorized cover stories for every checkpoint. Some graduates were parachuted into the rear of Army Group Center. Others traveled through the Baltic to urban safehouses. Among their instructors were veterans of Spain and early war sabotage campaigns, men and women who knew that success depended less on bravado than on invisible details. The right handwriting for a requisition slip, the right cigarette brand on a cafe table, the right time to be seen, and the right time to vanish. What we lack from the 1943 "Kill Hitler" discussions is the granular tasking, the name of the agent, the exact plan, and the assigned quartermaster issuing a disguised explosive. What we do have are planning templates and procurement lists that align with such an attempt. Microcharges disguised as everyday objects, watches reworked into timers, poisons cataloged by onset time and detectability. These were tools. Tools need a mission. In the autumn of 1943, as Allied leaders prepared to meet in Tehran, another story entered the orbit of our subject. The claim that German commandos planned to assassinate Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at the conference, and that Soviet counterintelligence thwarted them. This so-called Operation Long Jump has been debated ever since. Some argue it was a real plot. Others judge it a crafted counterintelligence narrative to justify tight Soviet security and assert primacy in the host nation. We raise it here not to relitigate Tehran, but to underline a context. Assassination, real or as rumor, was a currency of wartime intelligence. Plans, counterplans, and stories about plans all shaped how leaders thought about risk and display. In that mental universe, killing Hitler was not unthinkable. It was a line item in a strategic ledger. Let us return to Berlin and imagine the final approach, not as fiction, but as a reconstruction of what would have been required. First, anchor a base in a neighborhood that mattered: Tiergarten, Wilmersdorf, or the government quarter near Wilhelmstrasse. Secure an apartment through a forged work placement, perhaps as a displaced person with domestic employment, or as a German widow trading her spare room for ration supplements. Next, develop a source: a junior staffer in a ministry with access to ceremonial schedules, a policeman with the right kind of boredom, a building superintendent who overheard security arrangements. Then, test a method with a target whose profile is high enough to be useful, but low enough to keep fallout manageable. A bomb against a visiting official's vehicle, a timed device in an office used by mid-level party functionaries. Learn the intervals between security sweeps, the habits of drivers, the response times of patrols. Only after months of this, if at all, consider the principle. Even then, the final step would require more than a clear shot or a quiet room. It would require political approval, not from a colonel or a department head, but from the summit. Here we meet the most consequential "if" in the files. Some post-1991 testimonies describe a conversation that occurred in or around 1943, in which the Soviet leadership, briefed on the possibility of killing Hitler, concluded that he should live. The argument, as remembered, was that Hitler's strategic errors served the war's end. Eliminate him, and Germany might rally behind a competent successor. A negotiated peace in the West might allow the Wehrmacht to reallocate divisions east. The Red Army's road to Berlin might become steeper. Historically, we can test the logic, if not the exact words. In 1943, Hitler personally drove decisions that bled his army. The fixation on recapturing Kharkov quickly. The insistence on no retreat orders that trapped divisions. The green light for Operation Citadel at Kursk, despite compromised secrecy and tank strength that favored the defense. In that frame, keeping him alive looked like a hard, cold exploitation of an adversary's weakness. But this is where the archive's silence matters. There is no publicly available, verbatim transcript of an order reading, "Do not kill Hitler." There are recollections and consistent logic, and there is the absence of a Soviet attempt against him in 1943-44, even as internal German conspirators tried and failed. On July 20, 1944, German officers placed a bomb a few feet from Hitler and nearly succeeded. Their attempt, born from a different moral and political universe, demonstrated both feasibility and luck's tyranny. Even with insider access and military cover, the plot failed. For Soviet planners watching from Moscow, the lesson would have been obvious. Proximity does not guarantee success. Security responds with a ferocity that can close doors for years. The human dimension of this debate is often lost in the diagrams. Consider the officers who would have had to recruit the maid, source the explosive, and escort a young courier to the edge of Berlin. They could point to the Kube operation and say, "We did this." They could argue that dismantling the Nazi leadership, starting from the top, might shorten the war and save lives in cities whose names do not resonate in capitals. Yet they also knew the price of failure, not for themselves alone, but for families in occupied streets. And they understood the paradox. The more famous the target, the more the operation becomes an active theater, and the less it serves war's practical end. In the background, the Red Army absorbed and reissued the war's momentum. In July 1943, it stood on the defensive at Kursk, then counterattacked with armored strength that the Wehrmacht could not match. In the autumn and winter, it liberated Smolensk and Kyiv, pushing the front line west. In the months when an assassination attempt would have been prepared, the Soviet state discovered another way to reach Berlin: by marching. That is not to say the debate ended. Within the Soviet services, specialized teams continued to plan decapitation operations against regional officials, police commanders, and transport chiefs. Each success degraded the enemy's ability to govern occupied territory. Each success taught a lesson about timing, cover, and the morality of means. The decision not to target Hitler, if indeed that decision was ever formally taken, did not spring from timidity or lack of skill. It sprang from the conclusion that killing one man might complicate, not simplify, the victory that was starting to look possible. After the Soviet Union dissolved, former officers published memoirs and gave interviews. Archives opened unevenly, by decree and by whim. Some documents were declassified, others cited in footnotes and then resealed. From this partial light, we learn enough to reject the extremes. There was no master plan set in stone with dates and maps and a chosen assassin waiting for a signal. There was also no blanket taboo or moral refusal. There were scenarios, rehearsals, and a recurring strategic argument that placed the assassination of Hitler in a gray zone between desirable and dangerous. We also learn how memory itself becomes part of the story. In the 1990s, sensational narratives sold. We nearly killed him here. We could have done it there. Historians sift these claims, matching them against the surviving paperwork and the known structure of wartime Berlin. What remains persuasive is muted: the doctrine of special tasks, the example of Minsk, the logic shared, interestingly, across Soviet, British, and American circles about the risks of removing Hitler. What remains uncertain is the path not taken. Pause. Finally, on a scene at the war's end. April 1945. The Red Army closes on Berlin from the east. The American and British armies from the west. Underground, in a bunker first laid out in 1942 and reinforced through 1943, Adolf Hitler prepares for his last days. The security cordon that had seemed impenetrable unravels not because a bomb penetrated it, but because an army did. In the metrics of intelligence, one might call this a different form of access. Would killing him in 1943 have shortened these last 2 years? Or would it have created a vacuum filled by soldiers more willing to cut losses and trade space for time? There is no counterfactual ledger to balance those numbers. There is only the strategic logic we can read and the decisions we can document. For the men and women in Soviet state security, the calculus was less abstract. They worked with forged documents and careful hands, in apartments where one wrong knock could end a life. Their operations, whether in Minsk or Kyiv, were not chess. They were surgery performed in darkness. To plan an operation in Berlin against the most protected man in Europe, they would have needed not just courage, but a final authorization born of certainty. In 1943, certainty did not exist. War rarely grants it. And so the plan remained in drafts and discussions, calibrated to instruments that never played the final note. The war moved instead through divisions and supply lines, through factories lifted east and rebuilt, through railways rebuilt overnight and rivers crossed under fire. When Hitler died in April 1945, it was by his own hand in a bunker surrounded by the Red Army. History records the outcome without romance. The value of opening archives is not to fuel fantasies of what might have been, but to understand the choices people made with the information they had. In these files, stamped and restamped across months when cities burned, we see professionals working through a problem with brutal clarity. Whether the assassination of a dictator in 1943 would help end the war or prolong it. We see how capabilities built for heroism on a small scale, one bomb in one residence, confronted the architecture of a capital and a security state. We also glimpse the texture of lives lived inside these stories. A radio operator folding her antenna into a suitcase. A handler practicing the right dialect for a Berlin policeman. A forger tracing a seal so precisely that his hand cramps. None of them knows if the top line of the plan will ever be green-lit. All of them know that if it is, their margin for error is measured in seconds. The last words belong to that debate rather than to any single man. What does it mean, in war, to choose not to act? In the Soviet case in 1943, it may have meant recognizing that the most efficient path to Berlin ran not through a hotel room or a motorcade, but through Kursk, the Dnieper, the Vistula, and the Oder. The tools of intelligence remained sharp. They simply served a different aim. Years later, when a researcher opens a folder and finds a draft marked Special Purpose, they are looking at a fork in history's road, one that turned toward an army's advance rather than a pistol shot in a capital's night. The files do not speak in a single voice, and where they are silent, we resist filling in the gaps. But together, they tell us enough to see the contours of an operation that might have been, and the reasons it remained a shadow. Berlin's night fades. The footsteps echo retreat up the stairwell. Outside, the war continues to move, loud and wide, toward the city that once seemed unreachable. And in the margins of a report, in the careful script of a man who never knew if his plan would be used, is a note that could stand as an epitaph for the idea itself. Success is possible, consequences unknowable. Between those two truths, in 1943, the decision was made.